We're going to start today with our contributing writer, Jake Fogleman, talking a little bit about what's going on with the Supreme Court.
So this week, both you and I, Steve, we kind of dug into a little bit what we think is going to happen going forward after we heard oral arguments last week. I went a little deeper. I teased last week what the Supreme Court might do in terms of setting a standard of review for Second Amendment cases. So in a member exclusive piece, I kind of dug into what the text, history, and tradition arguments look like coming from both sides, how both sides have a good faith argument to make under that claim, and how the court establishing that might give gun owners some room for optimism to see courts strike down some restrictions, but I don't think it'll be too broad.
Right. And because I guess they have to go with something like that, right? It seems like in terms of what Kavanaugh believes and maybe what a number of the other justices believe, given what was said in Heller,
right,
where they rejected balancing tests, they rejected things like traditional levels of scrutiny, like even including strict scrutiny, which would probably strike down almost all gun laws in the country.
That's right.
Or at least quite a lot of them. And instead, they looked at this approach that was more based on what the text of the amendment says and how it's been historically interpreted, especially near when it was actually ratified into law in the founding era. And so, you looked a bit deeper at what that could actually manifest as in real life. And then I also did the same thing on perhaps a smaller scale, because that's one of the important things that could come out of the ruling, right, is a new standard to judge all other gun cases by.
Right.
But we also have what is going to happen in this specific case with gun carry laws, because New York's law is specifically being challenged here. It's called a may issue law, which allows essentially government officials to deny people concealed carry permits if they believe they don't have a good reason to have one. So it's a very subjective standard. So even if you go through the whole application process, you pass the background check, you do the required training, they could still deny you a permit. And in most cases, that's what they do.
Right.
Unless they believe you have some sort of special good reason to have one. So the question is, are they going to strike down that law, that standard, which is currently in place only in 8 states, but they're 8 rather large states, population wise. Places like New York, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland. And so about 25% of the country lives in these states. So it would have a minor impact on the number of states, but it would have a pretty big impact on the number of people affected. And it seems likely from going through oral arguments like you did, that they're going to probably strike down that law. And
I think
they're probably going to retreat. Yeah, they'll probably retreat to shall issue, and which is going to be a pretty big change, because basically, I mean, it's a minor change, I guess, in one sense, in that the only thing that changes is you take away that government discretion over who can get a permit. But that means a lot more people are likely to get permits, although maybe not as dramatically as the gun rights advocates would like to think, or the gun control advocates are worried about.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I think you're not likely to see a shall issue regime that you see, for example, in my state, Colorado, where it's pretty straightforward, minimal training, relatively low fee, and you get it within, a month or so. I think the Supreme Court, as you said, is very likely to strike down may issue, but I don't think they're going to really touch the requirements that states are allowed to do in order to institute shall issue, which is something you kind of touched on in your piece. So it'll be interesting to see how onerous these states make the restrictions should they be forced to go to a shall issue regime.
Right. Because I talked a little bit about the difference between where I live, right, Virginia, which is very similar to Colorado, where you live, in terms of its gun carry permits and the process to get them. But if you go across the river here into DC has a shall issue law. They were forced into it by the courts. So they're pretty good analogy, I think, for what's going to happen in these other states that are forced to adopt shall issue by the court, if the court does end up going in this direction, which is not a guarantee. Oral arguments, things said in oral arguments are not guaranteed to be how a justice comes out in the final ruling, but I think it's a fair to look at what they said and make some assumptions based off of that. And yeah, it looks like most of them want to move to a shall issue regime as the baseline for all gun carry permits in the country. Because obviously you also have permitless carry, which just doesn't require any permits as long as you can legally possess a firearm. You can legally carry it in a lot of states now. 21 states have that policy now. The most popular is still shall issue at this point. But if they move to that, if they force these 8 remaining states to move to that, they'll probably end up doing what DC did, which is effectively to, yes, have shall issue, but they make the requirements for what you have to actually go through to get the permit much higher than a lot of other states do. So in DC, you have to not just pass an NRA gun safety course like a lot of states require, because that's a widely available course, right? The National Rifle Association still has the largest training apparatus in the country, really probably in the world.
Right.
And so there are a lot of NRA certified instructors, including myself, frankly, who exist throughout the country, and you can easily get an NRA basic pistol course in any state that you want. But DC does not allow that to be it doesn't accept NRA courses as training for concealed carry, unlike Virginia and most other states that have shall issue. Instead, they require their own proprietary training, which is 16 hours, and you have to get a trainer that's specifically certified by the city, so there's not a lot of them. And the training costs, you have to go outside the city to get to a shooting range because they don't have any inside of the city limits. The training costs about several $100s in most cases. And that's on top of really high fees that they charge for both the application and for fingerprinting. I think it's $110 just to apply. And then backlogs make it really take a long time to actually get the permit as well. There's a 90-day waiting period. And then once you've gotten the permit, there's a lot of gun-free zones that they've implemented all over the place in DC, including ones that are mobile that follow diplomats around. So like if a diplomat is traveling in their car and they're driving by you, there's a gun-free zone, a theoretical gun-free zone you can't carry that travels with them around the city everywhere. Permitted events, so like protests and things like that, you can't carry at. So in theory, if you saw one of these things happening and they were coming towards you, like a march or a diplomat, you'd have to like run away to stay legal. Obviously in practice, I think they have to like give you a verbal warning before they could arrest you or something like that. But sure. They also don't allow you to carry on public transit, which is perhaps a bigger deal, especially for people who are low income. And so it's resulted in really only a few thousand permits being issued in the city over the last several years that they've had shall issue. And I think that's likely to be what you'll see happen in a lot of these jurisdictions that currently have may issue. They'll just they'll go to shall issue, but it'll be a really high bar, and they won't also allow reciprocity. So right. You'll have to get their permit in order to carry inside of their state.
Right. I think that's probably right. So you'll see maybe a modest increase in concealed carry permits right away just because of the shall issue, but it'll still be kind of prohibitive for certain people to really get a lot of permits. And it also, some of the restrictions that they'll allow kind of speaks to some good comments we got on our pieces. Reload member Cody Claxton was sort of asking about, well, would a positive ruling affect how local gun restrictions work? And I think you and I both agree the court's not really going to touch that in this ruling, we don't think. And future litigation is going to have to really settle that question. I'm sure it'll work its way through the courts in the next few years because that's almost certain to come up after a positive ruling in this case.
Yeah, I think that's the right takeaway there. I think what they'll do is probably say that restrictions on certain sensitive places is presumptively constitutional.
Yeah.
So places like courts or schools could be gun-free zones effectively under this ruling. I would expect that to be the case. They sort of talked a little bit about this in oral arguments, and the plaintiffs weren't against those sorts of restrictions.
Right.
And I think Cody's getting at more what DC has tried to do, or even Virginia in recent years, where they've allowed localities to create ever expanding and multiplying gun-free zones.
Right.
That sort of create this Swiss cheese effect of, you can carry here, maybe over there, but there's all sorts of little holes in your area where you can carry all over the place. And that can make it obviously more difficult to legally, to comply with the rules,
right,
as just a normal person. But I don't think the court's going to touch that stuff,
right,
in this ruling. I think they're just going to go and look at the standards, whether it's the standard for issuing a concealed carry permit or the standard for deciding gun cases. Those are the two things I'd expect them to actually deal with in this case. And then they'll probably just wait, like you said, for later litigation to really break down what exactly the limits should be for these gun-free zones in these laws. So that's what I'd expect to see in that case.